I'm Chris Halls. I'm co-founder and CEO of Life360. We're the largest app for families on the market with about 35 million total families using our system. Our core feature is location sharing. So pull out Life360, see your family on a map. You might think, what do we have to do with context? So I'll just give you one example. We recently did a deal with ADT, the home security company, that will take our family location data so your home knows where your family members are. And then when everyone's gone, we can do things like automatically lock the doors, turn off the heat, and turn on your home security system, all without having the user do anything. So we really are trying to provide that family and location data as context for third parties.
All right, I'm Kevin Shaw. I'm Chief Technology Officer at Sensor Platforms. We specialize in sensor software, and simply that means working with accelerometers, gyros, the sensors you find in your wearable and mobile devices. We work down in the embedded level, the silicon level, so we can provide always-on capabilities like context awareness, sensor fusion, and pedestrian navigation.
Okay, and as I said, I'm Jeff Stevens. I'm with ContextM, and I work with clients to help them reduce the noise that comes with all those notifications that we get on our cell phones where we say, WTF, what were they thinking? Why did we get that? So with that, why don't we begin? So we got some questions. So describing context is like the story of the blind men and the elephant going to the zoo, each grabbing a different part of the elephant and describing it. And I use that as an example because there are many different ways to look at context. So why don't we start by each of our panel members. We'll start with Chris describing how you look at context.
Sure, I think it's all about relevance. We're getting more and more signals out there, and there are a lot of services that are throwing a lot of things to your phone. You're mentioning all the notifications you get, most of which are terrible. So in my mind, it's making those pieces of data relevant.
All right, well, for me, context is local and personal. We carry wearables around on us, but they don't really understand us yet. They've done a great job counting steps and whatnot, but if I've got something on my wrist, I've got a phone in my pocket, I've got glass that I carry on my face, it can understand me from a contextual level. So if I can compute that locally and understand that locally, then it can help me in my life and intuit my life. It's not just about having, when I'm on email or on the web. There's 22 hours of the day when I'm not actually looking at a screen. In that case, these devices can understand me and my activities and my context.
I think just say something new, because you're right. The payoff of context is relevance. I think the interesting thing about context is that it's so multidimensional, so multi-layered. So if you think about one piece of data that might inform context, it might be useful or might not be. And the one I think about, we hear about weather a lot. What's the weather where this person is? Well, if you're in Minneapolis, then a sunny day is probably a really important piece of context. If you're in San Diego, probably not, because it's pretty routine there. So, even certain variables that people talk about, we hear people saying, oh, we want to send this notification based on weather in the local area. And it's like, that might be useful or it might not be. So context is variable in and of itself.
Excellent, thanks. So since the dawn of the mobile age, it's been said that context is king. Yet more and more we hear pundits and vendors, that content is king, we've been hearing all along. And more we hear pundits and vendors saying that now context is king and content is queen right there on the throne beside it. What are your thoughts on this? Chris?
Seems like an almost common sense statement. I think pundits like to say it, but to everyone who's been doing cool things, it's sort of obvious. I mean, if you have content that's not relevant, it doesn't matter. If you have context and all these cool signals without the data or content behind it, and it's also sort of pointless.
But then why do we have so many WTF moments, right? If it's obvious, how come it's not happening?
Execution's hard.
Well, I think we have so much content coming in for our phones. I mean, I have the entire World Wide Web just, a search away on my device. But that doesn't mean it's useful. Context means when I'm standing in a bookstore, pulling out my phone, why do I have to explain to it that I want to do a book search? It should know from a location perspective that I'm in a store. It's seen me browsing around, wandering somewhat aimlessly. It should be able to pull up the bookstore web browser. So allowing a device to have content is interesting, but allowing it to know the right content when I need it, well, that's much more interesting.
But I think to your example of being in a bookstore and having it pull up a search, the other element of context is, well, how long have you been there? If you've been there an hour and a half, perhaps you're looking for a coffee shop to go to next, right? So you got to be careful, right? I mean, and I know you know this, but that's the interesting thing about context is that it might be useful or it might not be. And now you got to, get rid of the book search and go to what you're really trying to do.
It's sort of like talking to a 4-year-old. A 4-year-old will understand you're in a bookstore, but they won't understand the contextual higher level. We can train machine learning devices to understand minor context. And I think you talk about this, that it's a higher level, deeper understanding that's still evading some of the algorithms.
Yeah. I mean, so to your question about content versus context, because I've been long in the content space back in the media companies I've started, and so, content was always king. I think of content like a water reservoir. And so you've got this giant, vast space of water. Context is the plumbing, right? So context is how you route it to whom and when. So, if I'm looking for a glass of ice water, that's very different than if I'm looking to, water my yard, or if I'm getting ready to take a shower, or my wife's going to take a bath, right? So it's like you've got all this vast reservoir of things, but you have to figure out how to route them and when. And the output of that is very different. And that's the trick. And that's, in our world where we're dealing with these big brands that are really trying to send the right notification, because, we've been big advocates of what we call good push, which is more notifications aren't better. It's more relevant, more useful notifications are way better. And so these guys are constantly trying to figure out how do we, if we have 10 million people downloading our app, how do we figure out what to send Jeff versus Kevin, right now, so that they look at that notification and say, hey, thanks for sending me that, versus WTF, as you mentioned.
And we might be at the exact same location standing next to each other and be getting totally different information, which will lead me to our next question, which is some view context as being about the location and others view it as being about the person. What are each of your individual thoughts? Why don't we start with you, Brent?
So this is really interesting because location can be a really strong signal of context, but again, it's looked in a vacuum. So the whole idea of geofencing, everyone's been talking about geofencing. We came up with a term we called advertising, which was, the early use cases was somebody walks in, you blast them with an offer, isn't that great? Well, not really. We think that's advertising, and people generally don't want that in most cases. So what's really more interesting is location history, which is if I walk into a place, is that my 100th time I've been there, or is that the first time I've been there? Was I there yesterday? Was I there last week? I mean, there's so many other things that actually determine whether that location is strong or not.
Well, I would argue that that's what I call macro position. GPS today is, good to 5 to 10 meters. But even in this room, GPS is going to be in the tens of meters. It knows you're in a building, but it has no idea what floor I'm on or what any of these people are doing. I think the more fine scale context is understanding inertial context. What am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I touching? That type of context is much more fine-grained. And from an inertial perspective, we know from the wearables we've got, I've got my Misfit on here, it can track the fact that I'm walking or sitting. So if you're sitting in this area, that tells me something. And that type of fine-grained context, I think, is where you differentiate and can really understand what are they doing there.
Yeah. For instance, are they sitting in the audience or are they sitting on stage? Right? Pretty big difference.
We can get that from heart rate, right?
There are a lot of use cases that also need more than one individual's context. So the reason people have been coming to us, specifically in the smart home space, is a lot of services do have geofencing. Like, all right, I left the house, locked the door, but if you don't have the rest of the family, you can have weird situations where you just lock the door and your wife's still at home. So tying many people's context together is also very powerful.
I think the home's a very rich place for context.
We had I always find that like actual use cases are usually helpful to understand what we're talking about. So we worked with the London Olympics a couple years ago, and they did some pretty interesting things with location. One is they were sending in like rich media photographs of the opening ceremonies, but only to people sitting in opening ceremonies. So they felt really special. Like here's you're the only people in the world getting this, right? And that's a great use of location and context, and pretty much everybody there appreciated that. But then what they did with location history was they said, we want to know what you thought of the track and field event 2 days ago. So they took that and they sent a notification only to the people that were actually at those events. I mean, again, it's a simple use case for location, but it really felt relevant to those people who said, yeah, I was there, and I would like to tell you. And what was interesting is they saw a 10x response rate when they sent through the notification versus email, which was interesting because notification is such a new concept versus email. But it just shows that because people were right there and they could just quickly respond to it, they felt like that was really relevant, and they engaged really at a really high rate.
So, Chris, you touched on this briefly in answering another question, but why is it taking context so long to become pervasive? And you started by saying because it's difficult, but maybe each of you could dive down a little bit and help our audience understand what the challenges are in trying to understand context from your perspective.
I'd say there are a lot of analogies to other technologies. I mean, like look at iPhones and iPads. Apple had a Newton in '93. Everyone thought in principle was a good idea, but it took another 15 years for the technology to become practical. And I think we're at a similar point where it's not easy to do this, and a lot of companies do amazing parlor tricks that look good in the press, but for consumer adoption, it's usually something that's almost dirt simple and obvious, just done really well. So I think we're going to see things mature to a point where we're going to see some really, really powerful but simple things that might actually sound pretty mundane, but all of a sudden tie everything together in an elegant way.
I would argue it comes down to the mathematics and the algorithms we're using on the underlying level. Fundamentally, we're using machine learning for a lot of this stuff. It's really powerful at understanding a broad range of different things. You can't come up with standing, sitting, walking, going into a place just algorithmically. You can do it with machine learning by training on hundreds and thousands of people doing the same event. Okay, great. But there's always one person that walks in a really funny way and does things different. Machine learning's powerful, but it's also somewhat fragile. So you do end up with these breaks and things where the demo works really well until that one person walks in. So there's still a lot of extra effort that has to go into making these completely robust. You can always cause something to fail.
So, completely different perspective than, I mean, I totally appreciate what you're talking about, machine learning. We spend a lot of our time with sort of the heads of digital marketing who are building these app experiences that many of us spend a lot of time engaging in. And so, what's happening is these marketers have spent 150 years, their world's been broadcast, right? Their whole world is, we've got a message we want to deliver, and we're going to send it out through whatever channels, direct mail, advertising, print, etc. And so they have to get completely reoriented today, because now they're realizing that that is not working, because this message jammed down the throats of people through their mobile devices gets them thrown off the device. So it's fundamentally going to take kind of the next era of unlearning what all these people have spent their careers learning. And so I think the reason why it's hard is because there's a lot of inertia built up. And so once people experience that, though, then they get really excited about it. So when you experience the value of great context and being relevant, then there's sort of no going back.
I would just add that it really is difficult, and the area in which my teams build context is by using semantic tools to mine the social sphere, Facebook, for example, of our customers' clients, to micro-segment them much better than you see in the traditional ad networks today. So that's one of the key ways that we reduce the noise.
I'd clarify that the difficulty is not just really the machine learning and all the deep technical stuff. A lot of it's pretty simple consumer use cases. Just having the world be used to these things and these products. And I mean, nothing we do is very technically difficult from a context standpoint, but it's getting people to adopt.
Well, I think the model is we're so used to people. We're used to someone coming up and recognizing me, understanding that I'm open for conversation. That's the world that we're used to, and I think we're going to expect our devices to have the same contextual understanding in the same way. That's the model that we're going to be looking up to.
I'll tell you so you talk about machine learning, one of the simplest use cases that's wildly successful is when apps put in preference center, which is explicit request. You tell me, customer, what you want, and then we'll figure out a way to get it to you. And ESPN Score Center is a great example of this, where, with all the sports information they could possibly route to you, they let you curate your own experience. REI does a ski report where they let you pick, when you want to get notifications or alerts about what's happened on your local ski hill. And, it's a really simple use case. You go in and you pick it, but the customers are delighted by it. Now, automating that and being able to take that to the next level is obviously where machine learning comes in and says there's a lot of different variables we can automatically take into account, and things like recent behavior, location, etc. So, I think it's an amazing frontier, and it's a really exciting place. And when you think about wearables, right, then all that gets taken to another extreme, because right now we talk about if my smart device, my smartphone, is irrelevant, how annoying that is. Imagine now that we're wearing this stuff, that gets taken to another level of extremity where people are like, if I thought that was annoying when it's in my face or on my arm, that's really annoying.
Chris, you want to add something?
No?
Okay. So how many people here in the room are familiar with Watson from IBM, played the Jeopardy game? So it's not publicly available, but internally they built something called WOW, Watson on Watson. So they taught Watson. They fed it every document that had ever been created about Watson. And it still gets some questions wrong. And a human can volunteer the correct answer. This is going back to the difficulty of machine learning and the impreciseness. So the human, when Watson makes a mistake, can correct Watson. But don't expect that Watson will give the correct answer the next time, because it's all probabilistic statistics. So for our last question, so we've talked a bunch about some of the challenges today. Why don't you help paint a little bit of a picture for our audience about what you think the roadmap is in context, where we're headed, and what the challenges might be?
I think from my perspective, I'm very focused on the device, on the wearable, on the mobile phone, on the digital eyewear. For me, it's about getting always on context in those devices without draining the battery. And we've seen Apple do that with their M7, the different subcore that allows always on. Samsung's doing the same thing, and a lot of other vendors. So it's about providing context 24/7 to allow devices, whether it's to count their steps or understand your life a little bit more, and providing a more rich user experience. And I absolutely see that happening right now.
So I'll comment not on the underlying infrastructure, but more on the actual consumer applications. That's what we focused on. And this is cliche advice, but finding that one simple use case really is key to almost every successful product. And when I've advised companies that have been in this space, almost universally I see people trying to do too much and try to do these things that are wow, but not necessarily practical. So we are going to have so much to work with, but finding that one thing is always going to be the challenge.
Yeah, I think the world is moving towards a higher bar on all this, which is great. Consumers' expectations are rising so rapidly, and companies are trying to keep up. So we've got consumers downloading 300 billion apps, I think is what Apple said yesterday. They've downloaded 300 billion apps from their store. That's unbelievable. So Brent, the companies where the economics are all sort of driving a lot of this innovation are still trying to keep up, but the consumer is actually leading the charge here. And so when the consumer experiences something great, something relevant through context, their expectations go up. And so everybody else has to catch up. So I think we're on this incredibly rapid sort of innovation curve because of that. And the consumer is going to demand it. Because once you experience it, you kind of expect everybody else to connect to that next bar. So it's really exciting. I mean, just yesterday, Apple showed off this new interactivity within notifications where you can actually just do something in the notification itself. Like something, respond to it. That's another whole set of context that's going to take everything to another bar. So the innovation cycle is so fast that it's just incredible to see what's happening next.
It's allowing devices to be more personal, and to delight the customer.
All right, well, I want to thank the panel very much, and I want to thank the audience for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the show.